Okay, hello. Today we are going to be doing my second favorite quotes in Burial Rites video. Now, just like the last one, these are only some of my favorite quotes because I think every single word in the novel is my favorite. But these are 10 more quotes that I think are awesome and I think are quite universal in the sense that they could be used in lots and lots of different ways. So we know in our exam that we're going to need to talk about a couple of different things. We know we're going to need to talk about identities, times, places, concepts, attitudes, values, beliefs, cultural assumptions, aesthetic features, and stylistic devices. So I've tried to find some quotes that cover all of those grounds. Quote number one comes from one of the historical documents that are in the novel, and it is from the official records and what they say about Agnes. And the quote describes Agnes as an excellent intellect and strong knowledge and understanding of Christianity. And the reason why I've chosen this quote is because I think that if you're going to look at Agnes, which you probably are, right? Majority of the time we describe her as being intelligent, and here's a great quote that supports that. It's also a really good indicator of that cultural assumption of religion because it's describing her as having a really good understanding of Christianity. Like, that's a really important thing in this society. So I think that this is a really good quote to have in terms of contextualizing our protagonist, but also in terms of really contextualizing, I suppose, that cultural assumption of religion. The next quote is a student submission, and this quote says, "Each passing day I become more like an animal to them, another dull-eyed beast." And again, this is coming from Agnes's first-person narration. Just like the last video, if I don't say who has said the quote, it's Agnes. This quote here is a really good example of those animalistic metaphors that we see all throughout the text. And I think it's a great indicator of Agnes's view on herself and her identity, her attitude as well. So by talking about the fact that others are viewing her, so society is viewing her as their perspective on her, I suppose, is that she is an animal to them, is really reducing her to that animalistic kind of level, thus stripping her of her humanity and of course furthering the notion that she does not belong. A dull-eyed beast just further exemplifies that, and we always talk about the fact that others view her as a monster, as a criminal, all of those sorts of things, and here is an example of Agnes realizing that and interpreting that herself, and in her perspective they're viewing her as a beast, which is a pretty powerful word to use there. 3 is a quote that is said from Nathan about Agnes, and he says, You're a cheap sort of woman. I was wrong about you." So if we're looking at the relationship between Nathan and Agnes, I think this is a really good example of how Nathan felt towards her. He says this out loud to her, so it's an example of dialogue, but it's also an example of characterization because it's allowing us to understand Nathan's character and what it is that he's valuing and how he feels towards Agnes. For him to describe her like this really showcases the disparity between the way they feel of each other. And if I'm looking at love in the novel, and the fact that the love that Agnes felt for Nathan is unrequited, this is a really good example of that. It's also another example of how others view her and also that reputation that she has in terms of her status within the society. Number 4 is from Margaret, and she says this when they are first told that Agnes is going to come to stay to them in Cornsa, and she says, "Are we just going to yield to this like a dog rolling over?" So if I'm looking at the relationship between Agnes and Margaret, and I'm looking at perhaps the growth in which it has, or if I'm looking at Margaret's initial reaction to Agnes, this quote is really strong to show that she was against her coming and she didn't want to yield to it. She wanted to kind of question it and all of that kind of stuff. So she was trying to not be so complacent in having Agnes come and stay with them. Number 5 is from Margaret about Agnes, as well. And this quote says, "Is it necessary to keep her bound like a lamb ripe for slaughter?" And I like this quote a lot because it connects to those animalistic metaphors that we see all throughout. But also in comparison with the quote we saw on the slide before, there's a massive juxtaposition between the way that Margaret's perception or Margaret's perspective on Agnes had comparatively, right? And there wasn't too much time between these two quotes. So she's questioning and she's saying, well, she's questioning whether or not Agnes needs to be bound up. Is she really that bad? Allowing Agnes to be humanized from Margaret as well, because she's kind of saying, well, she's not a lamb for slaughter, which is what Agnes so constantly refers to herself as. So we see Margaret valuing Agnes's existence here, which is quite powerful. Our next quote comes from Agnes, and it is something in which she is reflecting on. And I think that this quote is a really good example of looking at the concept of fate, looking like at retrospect, looking at hindsight, but also looking at religion as well. So Agnes is thinking to herself, and she says, "Perhaps things would have been different if Nathan had let me go to church at Thorn." So here we're also seeing the dynamic between Nathan and Agnes, and the fact that Nathan did not allow Agnes to do things. So we're seeing that, you know, ownership or power or authority that he had over her, that grasp he had on her. And also it's interesting because we don't see Agnes being depicted as being religious throughout the text. You know, Bjondel refers to her as a godless woman, and here all of a sudden she's saying, well, if I had have been able to go to church, would things be different here? So questioning her fate in terms of religion, which I think is really interesting, and I think that this quote could be used for a lot of different reasons. Next quote is about Nathan, and a lot of us, when we talk about him, we talk about the fact that he was called Nathan Satan. So the quote says, "Nathan Satan, that was his name. Nothing he ever did came from God." And I like this quote because it characterizes Nathan really well, but also again shows that value that the society has on religion, and the fact that people are even thinking, well, his actions are from God, shows us a lot. It shows us how others viewed him, and that perspective that was on Nathan throughout their society. Speaking of Nathan and religion, I really like this quote. So it says, "He built his church on wives' tales and the secret language of weather." And the reason why I like this quote is because wives' tales are mentioned a couple of times in the text. So at the very end, when Nathan is talking about the death waves, he's told that that's just a wives' tale, so there's a nice connection there. So it's quite ironic that Agnes says that that's what he builds his church on. Now, when we're saying church, obviously Nathan doesn't own a church. We're seeing church being used in a metaphorical kind of way. So his church is like his philosophy, his idea, and it's saying that it's built on wives' tales, so it's not built on truth or anything like that. So if I'm looking at the concept of truth, that could come in there. The second part of the quote says the secret language of weather, and we know that Icelandic landscape is so prevalent in the text, and it's saying that Nathan's entire ideology is just built on this secret language, which I think is really interesting. And for Agnes to be saying this about Nathan, I think is quite insightful because we know how she feels about him. I really like this quote, really like it, in case you can't tell. The next one we're looking at is quite long, and as I've said in the last video, if you've got a longer quote, you don't necessarily have to try and memorize the whole thing, but if you can have little bits and pieces, it can be quite powerful. So this quote says, "I am barren. I am the dead fish drying in the cold air. I am the dead bird on the shore. I am dry. I'm not certain I will bleed when they drag me out to meet the axe." So here we have the inner monologue of Agnes, so that first person narration style allows us to see this bit of text, and we're seeing this as an example of that stream of consciousness, because we're seeing her, she's about to meet her execution, and her mindset is dwindling, and she's saying that she is so many things. So using metaphors, I am the dead fish drying on the cold air, I am the dead bird on the shore. And I think that it's quite like, it's an ironic use of symbolism here, because we so often see birds as symbolism of freedom, but she's the dead bird, so she's the bird that's had its freedom taken away. The dead fish drying, so these animalistic metaphors, but in a sense that she is dead, sort of thing. And then towards the end of this quote, "I'm not sure I will bleed when they drag me out to meet the axe," is showing that complete lack of humanity, and the fact that Agnes has rendered herself as already dead. She doesn't think that she's got blood, and we know that blood symbolizes life, so she is reducing herself to being nothing. Another really long quote that again I would probably take bits and pieces from is Agnes reflecting on her relationship with Toti, and the quote says, "Sometimes after talking to the Reverend, my mouth aches. My tongue feels so tired. It slumps in my mouth like a dead bird, all damp feathers in between the stones of my teeth." So as you can see, this quote mentions a dead bird again, so there's a little bit of a motif going on here. I like this quote because I think if I'm analysing the relationship between Agnes and Toti, it's interesting to note that when Agnes is first starting to talk to him and connect with him and have these really long in-depth conversations, she leaves them being so exhausted that her mouth aches. And that's how I would take that quote from that little section there to use in my essay. We also see that symbolism of the stone being mentioned here, and also that her tongue feels so tired that it slumps in her mouth like a dead bird. That's so strong, such strong language that really showcases that this isn't something that Agnes is used to doing, because she is used to being isolated socially especially, and now she's got somebody who is caring for her for perhaps the first time in her life. So it's a great example of just how much that's impacting her, because she is so not used to having that kind of interaction. Now, my last quote for today's video, and again, if you want more of these, just let me know. I had quite a few requests from the last one, so happy to keep going. Could probably make about 35 of them, because we know how I feel about burial rites. But this quote says, "For the first time in my life, someone saw me, and I loved him because he made me feel I was enough." And this is Agnes talking about Nathan. And I think this is quite an emotional piece of writing, because we know what Nathan did. We know how horrible of a person he was, not only to Agnes, but those around him. However, she is reflecting on the relationship, and she is saying that Nathan made her feel like she was enough, and that's something that Agnes probably has never felt prior or since this interaction. And for her to say that it's the first time in her life that someone even saw her, it's really showcasing just how significant their relationship was for her, and just how much of an impact that it had on her. So if I'm looking at that in any capacity, I think this is a really great way for me to showcase my understanding. I also think if I'm looking at something like love or belonging or anything like that, this is going to be a really good quote to use to showcase Agnes's value and Agnes's attitude towards love, and how I think a lot of the time we might think that, and why she loved him, because we question that and we think, well, he's not a great guy. Why does she feel so strongly about him? Because he made her feel like she was enough, and that's a pretty strong thing, especially for a character like Agnes. So hopefully that was helpful, and that you learnt or maybe were reminded of some really great quotes from the novel. As always, please let me know what your favorites are, and let me know if you want me to make more of these. Have a wonderful day. I love you all very much. Bye!